Welcome back to things you don't learn as a computer science major that are really helpful to know if you want to become a software engineer. Up first, we have containerization. So to start, you've probably heard of Docker and Kubernetes, which are all containerization softwares, but I want to start really simply with what containerization actually is and what a container even is. So typically, if you're running an application locally on your computer or you're building one, you're going to have your own versions of different dependencies, runtime environments, and packages, right? And so if a friend of yours tries to run the same application, they might run into issues. This is where you start to see the issue where it runs on my machine but not your friend's machine, because you might have a different version of an npm package, and this could cause issues. And so this is why we have containers. Each container will bundle your application's dependencies, its runtime environment, and all of its packages into one single thing that we call an image. The image is just a file which actually defines all of the different versions and packages and dependencies and all that stuff. So you can kind of think of it like a cookie cutter where the container ends up being the cookie that you produce. You can even create like 100 containers just from one image, and they all start at the same time, but they can run independently. So now that we understand what containers are, we can understand what Docker actually does. So Docker essentially creates and runs these containers that you build with the images inside. And so your friend can run whatever images you have or whatever containers you put up in your application. And within that, it's going to have like layers of a cake. So on top of it, it might be Ubuntu and then Node.js and then your application code. And then on the bottom layer is going to be the npm packages. So as long as just your code changes, it's going to keep the cached layers and make sure it doesn't have to rebuild everything all over again. So this means your friend doesn't have to have the perfect version of npm or whatever it is. They can just run Docker build and Docker run, and they will have their own containerized environment. So now that we understand how Docker makes it really easy to run containers in your own environment on your own local machine, we can understand Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is what's actually going to allow you to scale your containerized applications in a production-grade environment. So Kubernetes doesn't actually run containers directly. It runs something called pods. These pods typically do just have one container inside of it, which has your web app or whatever it is. But sometimes you can have something called a sidecar or an init. And essentially with like an init container, it might initialize your database, or a sidecar might start logging things before you actually post your web app. Then you have a node or a machine that actually runs these pods. This node is either a physical or a virtual server that runs the pods themselves. It consists of a couple things like a kubelet, which allows it to actually speak to the Kubernetes pods themselves. Then it has whatever the containerized environment is, so if it's Docker or whatever they're using. And the last thing would be some sort of proxy to actually manage the web traffic. And finally, we have a cluster which manages all of these nodes. One of these nodes is going to be kind of like the brain or like the manager node. This does scheduling, this handles APIs and things like that. Then you have all the worker nodes, which actually spin up the applications and basically report back to the manager node. So much more you can learn here, especially with Kubernetes, but also with Docker and containerization in general. But hopefully this gives you a good primer for what's more to come.